Welcome to the Pencil Bob channel. I hope you enjoy my stories. Please like and subscribe, and hit that notification icon so you never miss out. Now on with the stories.
I never thought I'd see the day when our quiet little cul-de-sac would turn into a battleground, but here we are. It all started when that new neighbor, Karen, moved in about 6 months ago. At first, she seemed nice enough, always waving and smiling as she walked her yappy little Pomeranian up and down the street. But man, did things change fast. It was a Tuesday morning when I first noticed the orange cones lined up along the curb. I was heading out to work, coffee in hand, when I saw Karen arranging them with military precision. Curious, I walked over to see what was going on. "Morning, Karen. What's with the cones?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. She turned to me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, good morning. I'm just making sure our street stays nice and orderly. You know how it is with all these outsiders coming in and parking wherever they please." I raised an eyebrow. "Outsiders? You mean like visitors?" "Well, yes," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "And, the wrong sort of people. We need to keep our property values up, don't we?" I nearly choked on my coffee. "The wrong sort of people? Karen, what exactly do you mean by that?" She waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, you know what I mean. People who don't belong here. This is a nice neighborhood, and we need to keep it that way." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Karen, you can't just block off a public street. That's not how this works." Her smile faded, replaced by a look of determination. "Watch me," she said, turning back to her cones. I shook my head and walked to my car, figuring she'd come to her senses soon enough. Boy, was I wrong? Over the next few days, the situation escalated quickly. Karen didn't just stop at cones. She added handmade signs with messages like, "Residents only," and "No unauthorized parking." When people inevitably moved the cones or ignored the signs, she'd come storming out of her house, wagging her finger and threatening to call the police. I watched from my living room window as she confronted Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd lived on our street for over 30 years. Mrs. Rodriguez had her grandson visiting, and he'd parked in front of Karen's house. "Excuse me," Karen's shrill voice carried across the street. "This area is for residents only. You'll need to move your car immediately." Mrs. Rodriguez looked confused. "But I am a resident. I've lived here for decades." Karen's eyes narrowed. "I meant proper residents. Your guest needs to park elsewhere." I couldn't stand by and watch this anymore. I marched out of my house and across the street. "Karen, that's enough. Mrs. Rodriguez has every right to have visitors, and they can park wherever they want on this public street." Karen whirled around to face me, her face red with anger. "Stay out of this. I'm trying to protect our neighborhood. If you don't like it, maybe you should move somewhere else." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Karen, you're the one who just moved here. You don't get to decide who belongs and who doesn't." She pulled out her phone. "That's it. I'm calling the police. You're all trespassing." I turned to Mrs. Rodriguez and her grandson. "Don't worry, you're not doing anything wrong. Let her call the police. They'll set her straight." We all waited for the police to show up, and eventually, they did. A couple of officers arrived, looking less than thrilled to be here. Karen rushed out to meet them, dramatically pointing at the moved cones, arms flailing as she laid out her case. One of the officers approached Greg and a few of us who had gathered to watch the show. "What's going on here?" Greg crossed his arms. "She's trying to block off the street because she doesn't like who parks here." I moved the cones because, well, it's a public street. The officer sighed, clearly used to handling this kind of nonsense. He walked back over to Karen, who was waiting with her hands on her hips. "Ma'am, you can't block off a public street. These cones need to be moved." Karen's mouth dropped open. But they're ruining the neighborhood." The officer wasn't having it. "That's not how this works, ma'am. This is a public street. You can't dictate who parks here." "But I live here," she screeched. "I pay taxes for this road." "And so does everyone else," the officer replied calmly. "Move the cones, or we will." Karen, humiliated but far from defeated, reluctantly moved the cones back to her yard. She stood there, glaring at the officers as they drove away. And then, of course, she turned her fury on us. But Karen didn't stop there. Over the next week, she called the police so many times that they started ignoring her. She then took to patrolling the street herself, clipboard in hand, writing down license plate numbers and taking pictures of cars she deemed suspicious. The final straw came when she tried to tow my next-door neighbor Tom's car. Tom, A night shift nurse had parked in front of her house after a long shift because his usual spot was taken. I woke up to the sound of a tow truck and Karen's triumphant voice. "Yes, that's the one. This car doesn't belong here," she was saying to the tow truck driver. I ran out in my pajamas, along with several other neighbors who'd been woken up by the commotion. "Stop," I yelled. "That car belongs to Tom. He lives right there." The tow truck driver looked confused. "Lady, is this your property?" he asked Karen. "Well, no, but then I can't tow it," he said, shaking his head. "Next time, don't waste my time." He drove off, leaving Karen sputtering in rage. That's when something in our normally peaceful neighborhood snapped. We'd had enough of Karen's tyranny. As we stood there in our pajamas and robes, a plan began to form. "You know what?" said Mike from across the street. "I think we need to remind Karen what this neighborhood is really about." And that's how the idea for the block party was born. We spent the next day spreading the word, careful to keep it from Karen. Everyone was on board, even people from neighboring streets who'd heard about our cone tyrant. We planned for food, music, and games, all set up right in front of Karen's house. Saturday morning arrived, and we got to work. Tables appeared on lawns, grills were wheeled out, and speakers were set up. Kids started blowing up balloons and hanging streamers from trees. The smell of burgers and hot dogs filled the air. Karen emerged from her house around 10 a.m., her face a mask of shock and outrage. "What is going on here?" she screeched. I approached her, a plate of burgers in hand. "We're having a block party." "Karen, want a burger?" She swatted the plate away. "This is unacceptable. You can't do this. I'll call the police." "Go ahead," Tom said, walking up beside me. "I'm sure they'd love to hear from you again." Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red. She stormed back into her house, slamming the door behind her. But we didn't let Karen's tantrum dampen our spirits. If anything, it made us more determined to enjoy ourselves. Music played, kids ran around playing games, and neighbors who'd barely spoken before found themselves deep in conversation. Mrs. Rodriguez's grandson turned out to be a DJ, and he took over the music, turning our little street into an impromptu dance party. Even some of the police officers who'd been called out so many times by Karen stopped by, gladly accepting plates of food and joining in the fun. As the day wore on, Karen made several appearances, each time threatening us with calls to the police, the homeowners association, even the mayor. But each time, her threats were met with laughter and invitations to join the party. "Come on, Karen," I called out during one of her tirades. "Put aside the clipboard and have some fun. This is what being a good neighbor is all about." But Karen wasn't having it. She retreated into her house, occasionally peeking out from behind her curtains, her face a mixture of anger and disbelief. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over our little street, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Despite Karen's best efforts to divide us, she'd inadvertently brought us all closer together. People exchanged phone numbers, made plans for coffee dates, and promised to look out for each other. The party finally wound down around 9 p.m. As we all pitched in to clean up, there was a sense of camaraderie that hadn't existed before. We'd stood up to Karen's bullying tactics not with more negativity, but with positivity and community spirit. The next morning, I woke up early, half expecting to see Karen out there with her cones again. But the street was quiet and cone-free. As I sipped my coffee on the front porch, enjoying the peaceful Sunday morning, I saw Karen's front door open. She emerged, Pomeranian in tow, and began her usual morning walk. As she passed by my house, our eyes met. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something. Embarrassment, maybe? Across her face. But then her expression hardened, and she quickened her pace, disappearing around the corner. I sighed, realizing that one block party, no matter how successful, wasn't going to change Karen overnight. She was still the same person who thought she could control a public street, who judged people based on some warped idea of who belonged in our neighborhood. Over the next few weeks, Karen's behavior didn't improve much. She still glared at cars she didn't recognize and muttered under her breath about keeping the neighborhood safe. But at least the cones were gone, and she'd stopped calling the police every 5 minutes. What did change, though, was the rest of us. That block party had awakened something in our little community. People started organizing weekly potlucks, rotating houses each time. A neighborhood watch was set up, not to keep people out, but to genuinely look out for each other. Mrs. Rodriguez started teaching Spanish classes in her garage, and Tom began a small vegetable garden that soon expanded to include several neighbors' yards. Karen, of course, didn't participate in any of these activities. She remained a solitary figure, walking her dog and scowling at the increased activity on our street. But we didn't let her dampen our spirits. One day, about a month after the block party, I was tending to the tomato plants in the community garden when I overheard Karen talking to someone on her phone. "I'm telling you, Susan, this neighborhood has gone to the dogs," she was saying. "There are people everywhere, all the time. They're loud, they're messy, and they have no respect for property values. I'm thinking of moving." I couldn't help but chuckle to myself. In trying to control and isolate our street, Karen had inadvertently created exactly the kind of vibrant, active community she despised. As summer turned to fall, rumors started circulating that Karen's house was going on the market. Part of me felt a twinge of guilt. Had we really made her so uncomfortable that she felt she had to leave? But then I remembered the way she treated Mrs. Rodriguez, the way she tried to tow Tom's car, the way she'd called us all trespassers in our own neighborhood. The day the "for sale" sign went up in front of Karen's house, there was an almost audible sigh of relief from the entire street. That evening, we had an impromptu gathering in Mike's backyard. As we stood around, drinks in hand, Tom raised his glass in a toast. "To Karen," he said, a mischievous glint in his eye, "who taught us the value of being good neighbors, by showing us exactly what that doesn't look like." We all laughed and clinked our glasses together. As I looked around at the faces of my neighbors, faces that had become so familiar and dear over the past few months, I couldn't help but feel grateful. Karen had tried to divide us, to create an exclusive enclave based on her narrow view of who belonged. Instead, she'd united us, helping to forge a true community where everyone was welcome. The next morning, as I watched the moving truck pull up to Karen's house, I felt a mix of emotions. Relief, certainly, that our self-appointed neighborhood dictator was leaving, but also a strange sort of appreciation. Without Karen's misguided attempts to control our street, who knows if we would have come together the way we did. As Karen supervised the movers, barking orders and complaining about their handling of her precious possessions, I walked over, a peace offering in hand. "Karen," I called out, "I brought you a little going-away present." She turned, suspicion clear in her eyes. I held out a small potted plant, a cutting from our community garden. "It's a tomato plant," I explained. "I thought maybe you could start a garden in your new place." "It's a great way to connect with neighbors." Karen stared at the plant like it might bite her. For a moment, I thought she might refuse it, or worse, throw it back in my face. But then, to my surprise, she reached out and took it. "Thank you," she said stiffly, not quite meeting my eyes. I nodded, turning to go back to my house. As I walked away, I heard Karen's voice behind me. "You know, this neighborhood used to be nice and quiet. You've ruined it with all your community spirit." I turned back, seeing the familiar scowl on her face. Some things, it seemed, never changed. But as I watched her carefully place the tomato plant in her car, I couldn't help but hope that maybe, just maybe, a small seed of change had been planted. As Karen's car pulled away, her moving truck following close behind, I felt a chapter closing in our neighborhood story. But more than that, I felt excitement for the chapters yet to come. Our street was no longer just a place where we all happened to live. It was a true community, brought together by the most unlikely of catalysts. I walked back to my house, waving at Mrs. Rodriguez, who was setting up for her Spanish class, and at Tom, who was harvesting vegetables from the community garden. The street was alive with activity, with conversation, with laughter. And as I settled onto my porch with a cup of coffee, I couldn't help but smile. Karen might not have learned anything from her time here, but the rest of us sure had. We'd learned the value of standing up for what's right, the importance of inclusivity, and the power of coming together as a community. And really, isn't that what being a good neighbor is all about?
I would like to thank you for watching the video to the end. To encourage us to make more videos, please like, subscribe, comment, as well as share. Check out this other video if you haven't already.